B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn Ketubot Daf Yud Aleph. We're going to start from the Mishnah, the second line of the Amud. Says the Mishnah, and we saw in the previous Mishnah that when somebody marries a basula, a girl who's never had any relations with anyone, has never been married before, then her ksuba is 2 moneh, is 200 zuz. However, an almona is only 1 moneh. Now the Mishnah is going to give us a list of instances, a list of girls who, in spite of there being some issue, and it would seem that they should not be considered basulois, nonetheless they are considered basulois, in contrast to a similar list with one change detail at the end of the following Mishnah, at the top of Yud Aleph Amud Beis, where we'll see over there, indeed, they do not have the status and title of basula. Says the Mishnah, Hagyeris, a convert, a girl that was born non-Jewish, and she did giyur, she converted, v'shvuya, or a girl that was held in captivity, v'shivcha, or a maid, a slave, shenivdu, in the case where the shvuya, the girl that was in captivity, was redeemed, or the giyeris, the goya, shenizgairu, that became converted, v'shenishtachru, and the maid became redeemed, which means that these girls, they were in the status of being either a goy, or in captive, or a maid. All those were until the age of less than 3. And they left that state before they reached the age of 3 years old. Then ksuvasa mosaim, they have the status of a basula, and the ksuba is 200 zuz, 2 moneh. V'yeshlem tainis basulim, and the husband can expect to find basulim, and if he doesn't find basulim, either tainas domim that we've learnt about, or pesach pasuach that we've learnt about, he can come forward and say that his expectations were not met, and she's not a basula. Says the Gemara Omar of Huna. And now the Gemara is based on our Mishnah that there's a concept of converting, of being nisgairu, less than the age of 3 years old. That's an interesting concept. Can a guy convert at that age? The Gemara is going to discuss that now. Omar of Huna. Geir cotton, what happens if a very young child who wants to become a convert, or maybe he doesn't want to become a convert, maybe they bring him to be a convert, and we're talking about that he doesn't have a father who is doing the geirus for him or with him, and his mother is coming to Beis Din and saying, I want my child to convert. Matbilin oisei al das Beis Din, then the 3 dayanim take the place of the father, and they can convert him. Ma'iko mashmalon. What is Rav Huna trying to impress on us? Is he trying to impress on us the schus? Because we know that a child doesn't have the level of understanding to be able to make decisions for himself. Here, to make a decision to convert from being a goy to being a Yisrael is a very big decision. Sometimes we can do things for somebody else, but only on condition that it's a schus for him, it's a merit for him, and we assume that had he had the intellectual capacity, he would have actually agreed. But something which is a choiv, which is more of a liability for him, you cannot do that on his behalf, because there's no reason to believe that's what he actually would have wanted to do had he had the ability to make such a decision. So could it be that Rav Huna is impressing on us that the concept of geirus, the schus huloi, is actually considered a merit, and that's why Beis Din can do it for him? And this is a concept in other places in Shas, that one can merit for somebody else on their behalf with the assumption that that's what they would want to do. Is that what Rav Huna is trying to impress on us? And that's why matbilin oisei, matbilin is they put him in the mikveh, which is one of the things you have to do with gerus, is tefillah. The Beis Din can tovel him, and they will take the place of the father. Tanina, we don't need Rav Huna to tell this to us. We already learned elsewhere, there's zochin la'odam shlei befonov, ve'in chovin la'odam shlei befonov. This is a rule that we know in other places in Shas, that if it's shlei befonov, which means it's not in front of him, which means it's not with his conscious and complete das, he hasn't got the ability to make such a cognitive decision this way, an educated decision. If it's a schus, we can do it on his behalf. If it's a choiv, then we cannot. So we don't need Rav Huna to tell us this. Says the Gemara, no. Ma'od tema, I would have thought, oived kechovim, or goy, behefkera nichale, that we would have thought that a goy prefers the hefka, the non-committed life, the life of just being able to live with low morals or no morals, and therefore to convert him and being a Yisrael, we expect a person to live with morals. We know that regarding slaves, they definitely prefer to have hefkerus, to have no boundaries, and to be able to be engaged in any moral or other relationships. That doesn't bother them. The question is, if a regular goy is similar to a slave and is definitely behefkera nichale, prefers hefkerus, in which case converting would be considered a choiv, or do we say no? That a goy is, we don't say hefkera nichale. Komash malon, that's what Rav Huna was coming to tell us, the hanimili godel. That is only true with a godel, somebody who's mature and grown up. A guy who's already old enough to have tasted the taste of hefkerus, indeed for him it will be a choiv. The toam tam d'isur has already tasted the taste of a free life. Aval cotton, but a guy who's very young, that has not yet tasted the taste of hefkerus, for him schus hulo, indeed it would be preferable for him to join Klal Yisrael and to be a yid. Indeed, it's a schus, and that's what Rav Huna is coming to tell us. A ger cotton matbili noisei al das, based in because it's a schus for him. It's a benefit for him, not a liability. Says the Gemara, and let's try and bring proof from our Mishnah. Leima Masiele, can we bring proof to Rav Huna from our Mishnah? Because our Mishnah, we learned, speaks about Hagiyaris, a convert, Vashvuya, if she's been in captive, Vashivcha, or a slave, a maid, Shenivdu v'shenizgairu v'shenishtachru, that the Giyaris converted, the Shvuya, the captive, was ransomed, was redeemed, the Shivcha was set free. If this happened less than the age of 3 years old, then the Mishnah is speaking about the context of Basula, that she has the status of a Basula, and we'll see in the Gemara soon why. But either way, we see here that we have the concept of a convert under the age of 3 years old. My love, can we not assume that Belinu al Das Beis Din? Can we not assume that it was Beis Din that took the place of the father and did it for the girl, assuming it's a schus, like Rav Huna said, Nager cotton matbili noisei al das Beis Din? So our Mishnah would be a proof to Rav Huna. Says the Gemara, Loi, you don't have proof from our Mishnah. The Mishnah could be talking about where the father is the one that converts, and he takes the children with him to the Beis Din, because they prefer to follow and do what their father is doing and to convert. And that's why in the Beis Din, even under the age of 3 years old, we convert her with the Beis Din. It's not yet a proof that when Rav Huna is speaking about a ger cotton who doesn't have a father to convert him, and the mother brings the child to Beis Din, in that case, indeed, there's an added element of chiddush that Beis Din, it's a schus for him, and Beis Din do the tvila and do the gerus for him, and there's no proof to that from our Mishnah. Continues the Gemara, Omer Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef says that either way, either if the father came and converted the young child, or if the father didn't come and just Beis Din converted the child, so to speak, taking the place of the father, irrespective, doesn't matter, either way, higdilui, when this convert reaches the age of bar mitzvah, reaches a girl of bas mitzvah of 12, or a boy 13, yecholim limchais, at that first moment they can say, it was very nice that somebody converted us when we were young and immature and couldn't make our own decisions. Now that we have the status of a godel, that our decisions, we can make our own decisions, we can choose to protest that and say we prefer to revert back to being non-Jews, to be goyim, and they can do that. And then we look at them as goyim. Says the Gemara Esvei. We're going to ask a question on this against what Rav Yosef just said. This Rav Yosef says that a ger, when he becomes a godel, he can be moicha, he can undo the gerus. Then we're going to have here a question. Abai is going to ask a question from one source, Rav is going to ask a question from a different source, and later we'll understand why they didn't each ask from each other's sources. Abai is asking from the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, "Hagyeres v'shvuya v'shivcha shenivdu v'shenizgairu v'shenishtachru pchusos mibnois shalishonim v'yemechot ksuvoson mosayim." The Mishnah says that if this girl who became a gyeres at age less than 3, and then somebody marries her, then the ksuba is is 200 zuz, like a basula. The question is, if you, Rav Yosef, are right, and that higdila yechaylim nimchis, when she reaches the age of 12, she can undo the gerus and just become a goy again, then yavinan lo ksuba de ozla v'achla begiyusa. Does it make sense that we should give her ksuba of 200 zuz, and then afterwards she's just going to take it and say, I'm reverting back to being a goy, and take the money away? Answers the Gemara, Lechigadla. We don't give her the ksuba until she's a g'dela, until she reaches bas mitzvah, until she reaches 12 years old. And at 12 years old, once she's accepted to stay a yid, then that's it. We can give her the ksuba. Asks the Gemara, Lechigadla. Nami memachya v'nafka. Did Rav Yosef not say higdilu yechayla limchis? Yechayla limchis, that they can actually protest when they become gedolim. So what does it help to wait till she's bas mitzvah? At bas mitzvah is actually the time that she can protest. Says the Gemara, no. Kivan she'gdila sha'achas, as soon as she's been a g'dayla, 12-year-old, for a short amount of time, v'loi michasa, she didn't protest her being a Yisraelis, shuveina yechayla limchis, from that point on, she can no longer backtrack, and she stays a Yisraelis forever. And therefore, once she's a Yisraelis, and she's accepted and not been moicha for a short time from her bas mitzvah, we can give her the ksuba, and there's no fear that she's going to go back to becoming a goy. So that was Abaya's question. Abaya asked against Rav Yosef from our Mishnah that there's a gierus which is very young and we give her ksuba. And that was the question according to Rav Yosef, why should we give her ksuba? The answer is we only give her ksuba once she's old enough and late enough down the line that she can no longer back out. Rava is going to ask a question against Rav Yosef from a different source. Masiv Rava. Now Rav is asking a question against the same Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef who said, we have a question from a different Mishnah, a Mishnah we're going to learn later on Daf Chavtes. We know that if a person, he either seduces or forces a girl to have relations with him outside of marriage, he has to pay a knas to the father. And in some cases we even force him to marry the girl if she's agreeable to that. However, there are some cases where even though there would be reason to say that there's no knas, for example, he's not allowed to marry her, or there may have been a chance to say that she wasn't a basula, and if she wasn't a basula, then there's no knas, and then maybe he shouldn't have to pay the knas. Says the Mishnah, no. Eilu nairos sheyesh lem knas. The following are cases of girls that does have the knas of the 50 shekel, even though we would have had reason to say otherwise. Either haboala mamzeres, either if somebody does an aveira of znus with a mamzeres, and the mamzeres is not allowed to marry a kosher Israel, and therefore this person who did znus with her cannot marry her afterwards, and maybe we would have thought if he cannot marry her, then if he doesn't marry her, he doesn't need to pay the knas either. Says the Mishnah, no, he has to pay the knas. Vala nasina, vala kutis, and also nasina and a kutis, which we're going to learn about later on in the Masechta, where it's also for a regular Yisrael to marry a nasina or a kutis. And so I would have thought, since you can't marry her, you don't need to pay the knas. These are the three that we've mentioned in our Mishnah already and mentioned in the Gemara before. These are three types of people that either she was a goy or she was a slave, also a goy in slavery, or she was the Gyeris, a shvuya or a shifcha, or she was either in captive or she was a slave or a goy. In all these three cases, it's probable that somebody had relations with her because they're very immoral, and that's typically what happens. And if she's not a basula, then there's no reason to give her the knas. The knas is only for basulas. Nonetheless, yesh lem knas. Since they became, either the goy converted or the slave was set free, and then she becomes a Yisraelis, or if it was a maid that she was redeemed, then in those three cases, since it was before she was 3 years old, even if somebody had relations with her before she was 3 years old, then by the time she's 3 years old, she receives the basulim back again, and therefore she has the status of a basula. So these are all the cases where, even though there would have been a reason to say there's no knas, there is a knas. And one of these cases was a gyeris. that this girl who became a convert, she converted under the age of 3. So even though we would have thought that there's no knas because probably somebody had relations with her before, and then this person who was either ma'anasa or mafateha shouldn't have to pay the knas, we say no, since she became a gyeres before she was 3 years old, the basulim came back, and therefore she has the status of a basula, and anyone who violates her has to pay the knas. Says the Gemara, says Rava, if you're going to suggest, like Rav Yosef said, that once this gyeres becomes bas mitzvah, becomes 12 years old, she can say, I want to protest, I don't want to be a Yisraelis. Does it make sense that we give her the knas, the 50 shekel, and then she's just going to revert back to being a goy and take the money away from her with her? We don't give goyim the knas is for a bas Yisrael. Says the Gemara, L'chi Godla, we only give her the knas once she's a gedola. Asks the Gemara, L'chi Godla, Nami memachia v'nafka. We already said before, Rav Yosef said that higdiloi, when she becomes a gedola, then she can be meicha. What does it help to wait till she's 12 and then give her the knas? At 12 she can back out and say, I don't want to be a Yisraelis. Says the Gemara, as we answered with Abaya, Kivan she'igdilo sha'achas, after the time has passed, a short time from when she's 12, v'lo michason, she didn't protest her being Yisraelis, shuv einei chayla limchais, she can no longer be meicha, and she stays Yisraelis, and then we can give her the knas. Now the question is, why did Abaya ask the question from our Mishnah here of Ksuba Mosaim, and Rav Yosef asked from the knas? Abaya lo omar Rava. Rava asked against Rav Yosef from knas of Oines and Mafate. Why did Rav Yosef ask from knas and Abaya from Ksuba? Says the Gemara, Abaya lo omar Rava. Abaya asked against Rav Yosef from Ksuba, didn't ask against Rav Yosef like Rava did from the knas, because hasam knasa hainu tama. Why do we give a knas to these girls, even though there would be reason to say that he shouldn't have to pay the knas? It's just in order that somebody who did an avera shouldn't come away having gained by having done this avera and saying, oh, because she can back down at 12 years old, we're not going to give her the knas. That would be a good claim maybe, but that's not a reason to exempt him from paying the knas, because what you did was something you shouldn't have done. You shouldn't have had this relations with this girl. And just because it's true that we don't want the money to go over to, once she goes back to being a goy, she should take the money with her, that would not be a reason not to give him his penalty. And therefore, Abaya said, I'm not asking from knas, because even if she would take the money with her, he should still have to pay the knas. We don't want a choita, someone who does navera, to be niskar, to have gained from the fact that she could change her mind. Rava le omar Abaya, and Rava didn't ask the question against Rav Yosef from Ksuba like Abaya did, because what Rava will say, why is there Ksuba? Ksuba hainu tama shaloitei kalo be'enov lo yitzio. The reason that there is a Ksuba is in order that it shouldn't be easy for him just to divorce his wife. He should think twice. If he divorces his wife, he's going to have to pay for it, and therefore he'll think twice, he'll calm down, and he'll make a more sensible choice. So Rava is saying that the question from Abaya, Ksuba, it could well be that this girl, she gets Ksuba of 200 zuz. And it could well be that at 12 years old, she'll back down and say, I don't want to be Israelis, I want to go back to being a goy. That could happen, and that's not a reason to exempt the husband. We want the husband to all along to feel that this is a woman that I'm keeping, there's certain gravity to a commitment of marriage, and it shouldn't be easy for him to send her out. And if he knows that he's not going to have to pay ksuba because maybe at 12 years old she'll change her mind, then that marriage will not have this extra element of shaloitei kalobein of loitzia, and therefore Rava held that in the case of ksuba, even if she would take the money away with her, we would still expect the husband to pay the ksuba if he divorces her. And we wouldn't be afraid that maybe she'll take the money with her and hence exempt the husband. We would not exempt him before that. And therefore Rava didn't ask from where Abaya did from ksuba. Rava asked the question from knas. Continues the next Mishnah. Hagodol, a boy who's over 9 years old, and the day is over 9 years old, Shabo al Ktana, who has relations with a Ktana, with a girl who's less than 3 years old, or V'kotten, a boy who's under the age of 9, Shabo al Agdoila, that has relations with a girl who's more than 3 years old, that's That's case number 2. Case number 3, umukas eitz, a girl who lost her basulim not because a man had relations with her, but because she knocked into a piece of wood, and that piece of wood knocked the basulim away from her. All these 3 cases, ksuboson mosaim. She's considered a basula because a godel shebo ala ktana. We've already learnt that relations, a bia that is done with a girl under the age of 3 years old, the basulim come back. A cotton shebo ala gdoila, even though the basulim don't come back, but since a boy under the age of 9, the bia is not called a bia, it's called einei ra'u bia. Therefore, even though she's lost a basulim, she has the status of a basula. And mukaseis also, since she lost a basulim not because of relations with a boy, therefore she has the status of a basula and a ksubas on mosaim. Divi Reb Meir, that's the opinion of Reb Meir. The Chachamim argue, and they say that even though it seems we agree that Godel Shebo ala Ktana, she has ksuba mosaim. Cotton Shebo ala Gdoila, even though she doesn't have basulim anymore, she has a ksuba mosaim. Mukas eitz, that not. Mukas eitz, ksubasa mone, there the ksuba it goes down, and she does not have the status of a basula, she has the status of an almona, and her ksuba is a mona. Continues the Mishnah. Basula, what happens if you have a basula who she's been married? Normally, once a person is married, especially after the nisuin, the night after the chuppah, a couple are supposed to have relations. And so a girl who is an almona who's ever been married would be assumed to be a bu'ula. We learned in a previous Gemara on Daf Yomi Shiur that if she became an almona or gerusha or chalutza for after kiddushin, before nisuin, we can understand that typically till the nisuin there would be no bia, and therefore she's still a basula. What happens if she is a basula even after nisuin? For whatever reason, they did the chuppah and the marriage terminated before they ever managed to have physical relations even once. A basula who is an almona or a grusha or a chalutza, mina nisuin. In the Mishnah on Daf Yomi Shiur, it was mina erusin. Here it's from the nisuin. They're ksubos on mona. Even though we assume, and he married her assuming she was a basula, and therefore we would have understood if the ksuba would be 200 zuz. No. Since she's been in a surah, since she's been fully married, then she has the status of a mona, even though it seems that she would be a basula. Vein them tainis basulim, and for the same token, the next day the chosn can't come to Beis Din and say there were no basulim. They'll say to her, young man, this girl, your wife, had been married before. She'd had nisuin before, and therefore you cannot come with a claim that there's no basulim. And therefore the mona that he deserves, that she deserves, he cannot say, I married her assuming she was a basula, and it's a mekach tos, and you conned me, and therefore I shouldn't pay any ksuba. No. We say that the mona that she deserves is the mona she gets, and you cannot undo that with tainas basulim. Continues the Mishnah. This is similar to the case we saw in the Mishnah on the top of Daf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, but over here we're talking about that when did they lose their status of goy or captive or slave or maid? That was after they were already older than 3 years old. More than 3 years old in a day. In that case, since we assume that these girls, they are taken advantage of, they are violated, they are no longer besulais, and therefore ksubos on mone. If once they join Klal Yisrael and anybody marries them, then we assume them to be beulais, and the ksuba is only a mone. Ve'inem tainis besulim, and obviously since we assume them to be beulais, no husband can come forward and say, why was she a beula? Why was she tainis basulim? Why were there no basulim there? And I married her assuming and hoping she was a basula. You can't have such a claim, since when she was 3 years old in a day, she was still in a state of either being a goy, a maid, or a captive. Says the Gemara, Omar of Yehuda Omar Rav, who said in the name of Rav, Koton habo ala gedola. And this is a case that we mentioned in the Mishnah. The Mishnah mentioned that one of the cases that ksubos on mosayim, according to Reb Meir, and the Chachamim, it seems, didn't argue with that. We'll soon see. But the Mishnah says that cotton habo ala gedola, which means it doesn't have the status of a bia in many other halachas, but she does not have her basulim anymore, because this cotton removed the basulim, then she still has the status of a basula, and the ksuba is 200. Says Rav, Kotna Ba'ala G'doila Asa'o Mukas Eitz. Now, in the same way as when a girl is injured by a piece of wood and loses her basulim, and if that happens, then what's the halacha? We saw in the Mishnah, it's a machloikas, Reb Meir and the Chachomim, and according to the Rabbanon in the Mishnah, they say that the ksuba is only 100 zuz. Then so too, according to Rav, Kotna Ba'ala G'doila, since she doesn't have basulim, it will only be 100 zuz. That's what Rav held. Ki Amrita Kamed de Shmuel. When this statement, this quote was said in the name of Rav before Shmuel, Omar, and Shmuel argued with Rav and said, Ein mukas eitz bebasar. Mukas eitz is only if you're injured by an object, by an item, but not when you're injured by a person. When you're injured by a person, a boy, a young boy, then if she doesn't have the status of bu'ula, because the beer of a cotton under the age of 9 is not considered a beer, then all the while she does not have the status of a bu'ula, then she also doesn't have the status of a mukas eitz, and therefore the ksuba is mosaim. That's what Shmuel held. Here it was Rav Yehuda who said in the name of Rav and in the name of Shmuel. There are some who say no, it was a direct machlokes Rav and Shmuel. Kotna Ba'ala G'doila, Rav Omar Asa'o Mukas Eitz, Shmuel Omar Ein Mukas Eitz B'Basar. But the halachas are the same. Rav says that a Kotna Ba'ala G'doila, if the basulim have been removed, even if it wasn't by a piece of wood, it was done by a person, she does not longer have the status of a basula. Shmuel says that she has the status of a basula, all the while she's not got the status of a ba'ula, and since he is not a ba'ula because the beer of a cotton is not a beer, therefore ksubasa is mosaim. Asks the Gemara against Rav. Rav who said that Kotna Ba'ala G'doila Asa'o Mukas Eitz, Mosiv Rabbi Ishia. Rabbi Ishia is going to ask a question against this. From our Mishnah, Godel Shabo'ala Ktano v'Kotna Ba'ala G'doila u'Mukas Eitz. 3 cases. A Godel Shabo'ala Ktano, which is the case we're talking about here. No, it's not the case we're talking about here. We're talking about a case where a Godel, a boy of over 9, who had relations with a girl who was under the age of 3. There, everybody understands that she still has the status of a basula because the basulim come back if the relations happened before the age of 3. V'kotna Ba'ala G'doila, that's case number 2. This is the case where a young child has relations with a girl who's over the age of 3. Those basulim are not going to come back. Umukas eitz, the basulim have been taken away by an object, not by a person. Ksubasan Masayim, Divrei Reb Meir, we saw that in our Mishnah. V'chachomim oimrim, the chachomim only argued by mukas eitz and said mukas eitz ksubasan moneh. But it seems from the Mishnah that the Kotna Ba'ala G'doila, the Chachomim agreed to Reb Meir that the Ksuba is 200. So how can Rav say Kotna Ba'ala G'doila has the same status of Mukas Eitz? The Chachomim in the Mishnah don't hold that way. They agreed to Reb Meir that Kotna Ba'ala G'doila and Mukas Eitz are 2 separate categories, proof being that the Chachomim only argued by Mukas Eitz and didn't argue by Kotna Ba'ala G'doila. That was the question that Rabbi Ishia asked against Rav. Omar Rava, Hochik Omar. Rava says, you have to say it like this. Godel habo alaktano v'loy klum. That means the halacha goes like this. A godel habo alaktano, all opinions in the Mishnah agree, Reb Meir and the Chachomim agree, v'loy klum. It's not called a beer at all. It's an act which has almost no relevance because those basulim are so soft and she's so young and tender, they're just going to come back. It's like if a person puts a finger in their eyes, then one tear comes out, and then some more tears will replace it. It's something which those basulim will get easily replaced. Everybody says she has the status of a basula, and the ksuba is going to be 200. The cotton Ba'ala G'doila. If a cotton has relations with a G'doila and actually removes the basulim and they're not going to come back, then Asa'o Mukas Eitz. Then Rav is explaining that both opinions in the Mishnah would hold that it has the same status as Mukas Eitz when the basulim were removed, but not by something which is considered a bia, or Mukas Eitz Gufa. And what is the halacha by Mukas Eitz? And according to the way Rav is explaining, that Rav has to understand a Kotna Ba'ala G'doila would have the same halacha. Mukas Eitz Gufa pluked to Reb Meir Rabbanon. It's machlekes Reb Meir and the Rabbanon. Reb Meir say that Kotna Ba'ala Gdoilo and Mukas Eitz, since both of them don't have the status of a proper Bia, even though she's lost the Basulim, her Ksuba is 200, and the Chachomim say in both cases, since she doesn't have Basulim, her Ksuba is 100, it's one Moneh. Continues the Gemara. Omar Romi Bar Choma. We're going to discuss Mukas Eitz now. Machloikus, the whole Machloikus between Reb Meir and the Chachomim, whether Mukas Eitz is 200 according to Reb Meir or 100 according to the Chachomim, that's all. Till now we just had the discussion, does this girl have the status of a Basula? Does she have the status of a Bu'ula? If it's a Basula, it's 100. If it's a Bu'ula, like an Almona, it's 100. But there's another issue we have to discuss, and that is Mekach Tos. This husband can say, nobody told me that she was injured. I married her assuming that she was a Basula. She's not a Basula, it's a Mekach Tos. I've been conned, this is not what I bought. It's like somebody who goes into a shop and buys an item, and after the sale he realizes that they conned him and they gave him a different item, or they gave him a destroyed item. He can come back and say, Mekach Tos. The sale is invalid. I'm undoing the whole thing. It's not what I wanted. This is not what I bargained for. The question is, what's going to be in the case of Mukas Eitz? Can a person claim and say Mekach Tos and she doesn't deserve any ksuba? Omar Romi Bar Choma. So Romi Bar Choma claimed that the whole machloikus k'shehikir ba. If he knew she was Mukas Eitz, then there's a machloikus. What's the status of a Mukas Eitz? The Reb Meir medami lo leBoigeres. Reb Meir says, since he knew that she was a Mukas Eitz, she doesn't have Basulim, then she has the same status as a Boigeres, a girl who's over the age of 12 and a half. And we know that the whole concept of Basulim is only till the age of 12 and a half. After that we assume that the Basulim, they've just fallen away on their own. The whole claim of Tainas Basulim is only till 12 and a half. But this girl who's 12 and a half, even though she doesn't have Basulim, she's still called a Basula. No one's ever had any relations with her, and her Ksuba is 200. So Reb Meir says that by Mukas Eitz is no different to Boigeres. The same way as a Boigeres lost a Basulim at 12 and a half, then this girl, even under the age of 12 and a half, she lost a Basulim because she was injured by a piece of wood. But it has the same status as a Boigeres. She's not called Be'ula, and her Ksuba is 200. That was the opinion of Reb Meir, and that's Hikir Bob, because he knew in advance. He knew that she was a Mukas Eitz. Rabbanon, Madami Lo LeBe'ula. Rabbanon say no. Say she's not 12 and a half years old. Rabbanon say she was less than 12 and a half years old. Why has she not got Basulim? She's got the status of a Be'ula. If she has the status of a Be'ula, then her Ksuba is 100. And that's the Machleikas, but that's only because Hikir Bo, he knew in advance she was a Mukas Eitz. Avaloi Hikir Bo. But if he didn't know before, he thought that this girl was a regular girl who's a Basula, and then he realizes afterwards there's no Basulim, and he finds out she was Mukas Eitz, she was injured by a piece of wood. Divrei Hakel v'lo klum, everybody agrees she gets no ksuba whatsoever because it's a Mekach Tos. That is what Romi Bar Choma says. V'Reb Meir amay medami lo leBoigeres. What in the case of Hikir Bo, where he knew that she was a Mukas Eitz, Reb Meir says she gets 200 because she's got the same status as a 12 and a half year old. The question is, why do we compare to a 12 and a half year old? Nidamya leBe'ula. Why don't you compare to any other child who's under the age of 12 and a half, who doesn't have Basulim, and has the status of a Be'ula? And then she'll only get Monet. Both the Mukas Eitz and the Be'ula, the Basulim were not removed just by the passage of time, like a Boigeres, like a 12 and a half year old. Both of them were removed with some act. Something happened. So the same way as a Be'ula, something, namely a man, removed the Basulim, Mukas Eitz, a piece of wood, removed the Basulim. They should have the same status. Answers the Gemara. Be'ula is avid b'maisa b'de odom. You're right that both the Be'ula and the Mukas Eitz, something happened, but it depends by who. By a Be'ula, it happened by a person, and therefore her status goes down from 200 to 100. She has the status of a Be'ula. But in the case of Mukas Eitz, lo is avid b'maisa b'de odom. Since it wasn't a human being that did the action, it's just a piece of wood, she just got injured, it has the same status as a Boigeres, that no human being did any action to remove those Basulim, and therefore she has the status of a Boigeres, and the Ksuba is 200. The Rabbanon again, talking about Hikir Bo, he knew she was a Basula, she knew that she was a Mukas Eitz, and the Rabbanon say that she gets 100, not 200. The question, why? Because we compare her to a Be'ula, because both of them, an action happened in the same way as a Be'ula, the the basulim were actually removed, so too by mukas eitz something removed them, and therefore she has a ksuba of moneh. If you're comparing her to a be'ula, nidmaya le begeres. Why don't you say that in the same way as a begeres, the basulim was removed not by the act of a human being, so too mukas eitz, the act was not done by a human being, and they should both, and the same way as a begeres has the status of basula as far as ksuba is concerned, that she has a ksuba of mosaim, 200, so too mukas eitz should be mosaim. Answers the Gemara, no. Begeres lo yisavid b'maisa klal. A begeres, nothing happened to her at all. The basulim got lost just by virtue of the passage of time. However, mukas eitz is avid b'maisa. Something happened. It's true it wasn't a human being that did it. It was a piece of wood, but it happened. Since it happened, we compare it to a be'ula, and the ksuba is only, moneh is only 100 zuz. And then that's all regarding hikirba. But we said, Rami Bar Chama said, that avaloi hikirba, if he didn't know she was a mukas eitz, he didn't know that he shouldn't expect that there should be any basulim left, the divir hakel v'loi klum. Everybody agrees that there's no ksuba whatsoever, it's a mekach tos. That's what we saw from Rami Bar Chama. Moser Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman is asking a question against Rami Bar Chama. Hi oimeres mukas eitzani. And we're going to learn about this later, Mishnah on Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. What happens if she says, you're right, there was no basulim, but you know why there's no basulim? Because mukas eitz, I got injured by a piece of wood. And he claims, Loi ki elod rusas ishat. No, it's not true. It's that the reason you don't have basulim is not because of mukas eitz, it's because before we got married, you had relations with somebody. You were a bu'ula, a regular bu'ula. And if you're a bu'ula, and nobody told me about this before, and therefore he is saying that it's a mekach tos. So Reb Gamliel, Reb Eliezer Oimrim, Reb Gamliel and Reb Eliezer both say nemenes, that she is believed and she gets a ksuba. She gets the ksuba. She said mukas eitzani. She gets the ksuba. The question is, why should she get ksuba, even as a mukas eitz? But it's very clear from this dialogue that he assumed she was a regular basula. He didn't know she was mukas eitz. And now there's a discussion, did she lose her basulim because of mukas eitz or because she had relations with a man before she got married? It was drusas ish. But either way, Rami Bar Chama just said now that if loy hikirba, if he didn't know she was not a basula, it's a mekach tos. So why over here ne'emenes, that we accept her claim that she's a mukas eitz, she shouldn't get any ksuba anyway, because he can claim mekach tos. What's the difference why you don't have basulim? It's a mekach tos. Ela Omar Rava. Rava argues with what we said before from Rami Bar Chama. Rava argued and said as follows: Bein hikirba, bein loy hikirba, irrespective of whether it was he knew before or he didn't know before, according to Reb Meir, mosaim. It's the same as a begeres, that she gets a ksuba of mosaim, even if loy hikirba. Since the reason she's not a basula is not be'ula, there's no claim of mekach tos, and therefore she gets the ksuba of mosaim. However, le Rabbanon, only according to the Rabbanon, if hikirba, if he knew she was a mukas eitz, then moneh, she gets a moneh like a be'ula, like we saw before. Loy hikirba, if he didn't know that she was mukas eitz, v'loy klum, then indeed it's mekach tos. That is how Rava explains. That means Rami Bar Chama, we had an issue, because in the Mishnah it's clear, in the Mishnah Daf Yud Gimel, that we saw that if there's a discussion between him and her whether she was drusas ish or she was mukas eitz, then she's ne'emenes. So you see there clearly that even when she didn't know, even though he didn't know, there's still a ksuba. According to Rami Bar Chama, there's no way of holding that. It doesn't work not with Reb Meir and not with the Chachamim of our Mishnah, because Reb Meir said that if lo hikirba, kula alma moida v'lo klum. So Rava said now that according to Reb Meir, indeed, mukas eitz is not mukas eitz. According to Reb Meir, even hikirba or lo hikirba gets 200. According to the Chachamim, hikirba, it's 100. Lo hikirba is mekach tos. So that Mishnah that says that she gets ksuba, it must be Reb Meir. It can't be the Chachamim, because the Chachamim say again, if lo hikirba, she doesn't get any ksuba. What's ne'emenes? So according to Rava, that Mishnah is going to follow the opinion of Reb Meir. Says the Gemara, v'hodar bei Rava. But Rava changed his mind. Rava said that even according to the Chachamim, there's no mekach tos by mukas eitz. Just the same way as Reb Meir says that bein hikirba, if he knew or if he didn't know she was mukas eitz, she gets 200 like a bu'ula. According to the Chachamim, bein hikirba, bein lo hikirba, she gets 100 like a bu'ula. And there's no claim of mekach tos. And if Rava changed his mind that way, then the Mishnah that says ne'emenes could be Reb Meir, and it could be the Chachamim, because it just says ne'emenes. She gets ksuba. How much ksuba? It's lo hikirba. How much ksuba? According to Reb Meir, 200. According to the Chachamim, it will be 100. But now we have to determine, where do we see that according to Rava, he changed his mind, and even according to the Chachamim, who say that when hikirba, when he knew she was mukas eitz, she has the status of a bu'ula, not that of a begeres, and she gets only 100. But when it's lo hikirba, when he didn't know bichlal that she was a mukas eitz, still she gets the same 100, and he cannot say it's a mekach tos. Where do we find that Rava changed his mind to say this? The Tanya, we learned in a brisa, Keitzad hoitzoas shemra. There's a concept when a man marries his wife, and then the next day he comes to Beis Din and says there were no basulim. And then Beis Din realized that there were basulim, and he just bad-mouthed her. That's called hoitzoas shemra, and he has to pay a knas. Keitzad hoitzoas shemra. How does all this work? Ba'ala Beis Din v'omar, if this chosn comes to Beis Din and says, v'omar ploini, this person says, Loi matzasi lebitcha psulim. He says to the father of this girl, your daughter didn't have any basulim. Im yesh eidim shezin tachtov. If there's eidim that she did znus after the kiddushin, after she was ready in Eishes Ish, yesh lo ksuba mona, then she gets the ksuba of 100. And straight to the Gemara says, I don't understand. Something doesn't feel right here. Im yesh eidim shezin tzotachta. There's eidim that she did znus after she was married to him as Neishes Ish. Baskilahi. She gets killed by stoning. What do you mean she has the ksuba of moneh? No, hochikoma. No, you have to read it as follows. Im yesh eidim shezin tzotachta beskila. If there's eidim she did znus after she was married to him, of course she gets skila. Zin mikor. But if she did znus before she married him, then yesh lo ksuba moneh. Then she gets the ksuba of a moneh, because when she married him, then she was already a bu'ula. And a bu'ula, as with any almana, only has a ksuba of moneh, which is 100 zuz. So, v'omer Reb Chia bar Ovin, Omer Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes says, Zoy Semeres. What do you see from here? It's clear from here that when it says that he got married to her, thinking she was a basula. There were no basulim. He came to Beis Din, and it became apparent that she did znus before he ever knew her, before he got married to her at all. And we say she gets a moneh, not the 200, because she wasn't a basula. She gets a moneh. I don't understand. It would seem from here that Konsa b'cheskas basula, he married her with the assumption that she was a basula. V'nimtzeis bu'ula, and then realized afterwards that she was not basula. Yesh lo ksuba moneh. She gets the moneh, a ksuba of moneh. We don't say mekach tos. She gets a moneh. That's what Rav Sheshes determined from the halacha from that brisa. Umosiv Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman asked a question against Rav Sheshes, because we're going to learn in the Mishnah. If somebody marries a girl and there's no basulim, she claims Misha irastani ne'enasti. After the erusin, that means when we did the kiddushin, I was still a basula. After the erusin, between the erusin and the nisuin, somebody did znus with me by force. She doesn't become asa. It was an einus. I didn't have any choice. Ne'enasti. She says it's bad luck. It's like if you had had a field and there's bad luck and a flood comes and floods the whole field. Okay, here also you have a wife and somebody took advantage of her, and I'm sorry, but that was just your bad luck. And there's no reason she should lose the ksuba in any way. But he claims loy. He says no. He says, what do you mean? You didn't do znus b'oinus after we got married, after the kiddushin. You had relations with somebody before we got married, and when we got married, you were no longer a basula, and you didn't tell me that. It's a mekach tos. And it seems that we accept his claim that even that since he married her b'cheskas basula, assuming she was a basula, and then it became apparent she's not a basula, mekach tos, she doesn't get anything. So this is what Rav Nachman is asking from here against what Rav Sheshes determined from the brisa. That from the brisa you see that if he comes after the chasna and says there was no basulim, and she says yes, and she says that before we got married there was a znus, it says that ksubas moneh, and here it says that mekach tos v'les lo klal. And the Gemara determines, as we just explained, that if he says mekach tos means she doesn't get any ksuba. And this is Rav Nachman's question. Rav Nachman says it's clear from the Mishnah that if he married her assuming she was a basula and she wasn't a basula, mekach tos, she gets no ksuba whatsoever. And this contradicts what Rav Sheshes saw in the Brisa before, that if she says that there was a znus before we got married, that yesh lo ksuba samoneh. Omar lahu Rav Chia bar Ovin. Rav Chia bar Ovin said to Rav Nachman, Efsher of Amram v'chol gadoy le'adoy yosvi ki Omar of Sheshes laho shmaita. We have to realize that Rav Amram and all the leaders of the generation were there when Rav Sheshes said what he said. He quoted that brisa, and Rav Sheshes said from this brisa it's clear that konso b'cheskas besula v'nimtzos be'ula yesh lo ksuba moneh v'kashilu. And this question from this Mishnah was actually asked. How can you say that konso b'cheskas besula v'nimtzes be'ula yesh lo ksuba? We're going to see in the next Mishnah, which is the Mishnah that Rav Nachman asked a question from on Daf Yud Beis Amud Beis, that hanoi se'isha v'lo yimotzu lo besulim, that he can claim mekach tos v'kashilu umeshani, and they answered my mekach tos nami. Mimosayim, when it says in the Mishnah mekach tos, it doesn't mean mekach tos and you don't get anything. Mekach tos means you can't be expected to receive 200 because you were not a besula. Aval mono isla. They all explain the Mishnah not like you, Rav Nachman, are assuming. You, Rav Nachman, assumed that mekach tos means she doesn't get anything. No, all the Chachmei Ador, they heard him answering that when it says mekach tos, it just means that you can't expect him to pay the whole thing. But moneh, like a be'ula, she'll get. Vat omras leslo klal. All the Gedolei Ador agreed that's how to learn the Mishnah. And you, Rav Nachman, are saying the Mishnah means that she doesn't get anything, and then you're asking a question. Va'oma Rava, and Rava responded, Manda kamoisiv, shapir kamoisiv. No, Rav Nachman was right. When the Mishnah says mekach tos, it means she doesn't get anything. Mekach tos legamri mashma. You're going to ask a question. How can you say that from the Mishnah that the mekach tos, that konso b'cheskas besula, v'nimtzes be'ula, yeshla, that he doesn't get anything, she doesn't get anything because of mekach tos, and that's contrary to what Rav Sheshes understood from the brisa that says that she gets a ksubas moneh. Toritz v'ei mahachi. I'll tell you an answer to that. You have to read into the brisa as follows. What did it say in the brisa? The brisa said, Keitzad oitzoas shemra. How is there oitzoas shemra? V'ola bezdin v'oma ploini lo imatzasi lebitcha psulim. Im yesh edim shezin tzotachtav yesh lo ksubas moneh. The first version of the brisa didn't make any sense. It said there, if there's edim that she did znus after she got married, she gets a ksubas moneh. We said straight away that can't be, she gets killed. Then we said, no, what the brisa means is if there's edim that she did znus before they got married, then she gets a ksubas moneh, and we have a problem. Our Mishnah says that's mekach tos. You have to read into the brisa as follows. Im yesh edim shezin tzotachtav, if the edim say that she did znus while she was married to him, beskila, of course she gets skila, because she's an eshes ish. Zin mikor, if she did znus before she got married, v'loi klum, don't say ksubas moneh. We'll get to the ksubas moneh in a minute. For now, if they say that the znus was before they got married, v'loi klum, you don't get anything, exactly like it says in the Mishnah, because he can say mekach tos. It was konso b'cheskas besula v'nimtzes be'ula. However, so when the brisa says that she gets a moneh, what's that talking about? Nimtzeis mukas eitz. You have to introduce something in the brisa that wasn't written in the original text that we had from the brisa. That if she was a mukas eitz, if it becomes apparent that the reason that there's no besulim is because she was injured by a piece of wood, then yesh lo ksubas moneh. Then she gets a ksuba. How much? A moneh. A moneh, like the rabbonon. The rabbonon say he gets a moneh. And here the big question is, we're talking there about that he came to the Beis Din the day after he got married, and he says there was no besulim. And the brisa says, if it became apparent that she was mukas eitz, then yesh lo ksubas moneh, she gets a moneh. It's certainly not Reb Meir, because Reb Meir says a mukas eitz gets 200. It must be the rabbonon. Here we're talking about loy hikirbo. He didn't know before he got married that she was a mukas eitz, so it was loy hikirbo, and it's not Reb Meir, it must be the rabbonon, and you get ksubas moneh. I don't understand. You rather said before that according to the rabbonon, if hikirbo, you get 100. Lo hikirbo, it's a mekach tos, you don't get anything. And here Rava himself was reading into the brisa that the ksubas moneh is if it becomes clear afterwards that the reason she had no besulim was because she was mukas eitz, she gets ksubas moneh. V'harava da Omar, did Rava not say before the Rabbanon, according to the Rabbanon who argued with the Rabbi Meir, loy hikir ba v'loy klum, that if he didn't know that she was a mukas eitz, it's a mekach tos. Eloshma mino, it's clear from here that Hodar be Rava me'ahi, Rava changed his mind and said that according to Rabbi Meir, bein hikir ba, bein loy hikir ba is 200. According to the Rabbanon, bein hikir ba, bein loy hikir ba is 100. So that Mishnah on Daf Yud Gimel we asked from before, where we said that from the Mishnah it's clear that she's ne'menes to say mukas eitz, and ne'menes means she gets ksuba, and we didn't know who it was, because at first Rami Bar Choma said that if lo hikir ba, everybody says it's mekach tos. Now it's completely the opposite, that nobody says it's a mekach tos. Mekach tos is if she was a bu'ula, but mukas eitz is not a strong enough issue to come with the claim of mekach tos. There's no mekach tos, and according to the Rabbi Meir, even if lo hikir ba, the ksuba is mosaim. According to the Rabbanon, even if lo hikir ba, the ksuba is mona. Continues the Gemara, and this is continuing the concept of konsa b'cheskas b'usula v'nimtzeis b'ulo yeshlo ksubas mona, and where we're holding now is konsa b'cheskas b'usula v'nimtzeis b'ulo. If it was because of a bia, then it's a mekach tos. If it was because of mukas eitz, it's not mekach tos. Tonu Rabbanon. Konsa, if he did the chuppah, konsa rishoin l'shum nisuin. If her first husband married her and she was a chuppah from nisuin, and the chuppah was done. However, v'yesh lo eidim shelo nistara, but there's eidim that from the time of the chuppah they were never in a secluded place, which means that according to these eidim, if we can rely on these eidim, then even though they were not only kiddushin, it was also nisuin, there's been a chuppah, but this girl has never had any physical relations with anyone, with her husband, she's still a basula. Ina minister of or even if there's eidim who say they were in a secluded place, but not long enough to have actually been able to do a bia, then for whatever reason that marriage terminates and she remarries, then the second husband can't come with a claim and say, why has she not got any basulim? Why? Because we assume, since there was a chuppah, she's got a cheskas be'ula. You can't assume that she's a basula. Shari can't rishain, because at the end of the day, you did a chuppah. And when you do a chuppah, once there's a chuppah and a proper nisuin, then every wife has the status of a be'ula. And you have to assume, yes, Eidim, not Eidim, will soon see. If this woman went under the chuppah, you assume that she's a be'ula. Omar Rava. So Rava deduced from there that Zoisei Meres, from the fact that he cannot claim Tainas Basulim, means that he would have a reason to say there was no Basulim. Where the Basulim? Why are you claiming this? You know that she was married before? No. So it seems that this husband assumed that she was a Basula, and he married her, and then there were no Basulim, so he wants to come to Beis Din and say Mekach Tos. We say no. He cannot claim Tainas Basulim. Zoisei Meres, says Rava, because if it says that it means that coming to Beis Din is not going to help you anything. She's not going to lose any of her ksuba, which means that she gets a ksuba mona. This is what Rava said. Rava said, she has a ksubas mona. And this is not like Rava said before, that that it's a mekach tos completely and she doesn't get anything. Ravashi Omar. Ravashi says, Ravashi says no. I believe that in a regular case of konso b'cheskas besula v'nimtzeis be'ula, it's a mekach tos and don't get anything. V'shani hoch, in this particular case, shari konsa rishain, because even though there were eidim who said that they didn't have an opportunity to do a bia, but nonetheless there was a chuppah here, and since there was a chuppah, therefore we assume you had no good reason to say that she was definitely a basula. And therefore in this case, says Ravashi, that he cannot make the claim, and indeed she gets the ksuba of a mona. But in a regular case where you had every right to say, konsa b'cheskas basula, I married her with the assumption to be a basula, and she wasn't a basula, indeed, that it is a mekach tos. And now the Gemara is asking, But in that brisa that we saw, that konsar rishon nishum nisuin, if the first person, the first husband, did a nisuin, did a chuppah, and there were edim that said that it seems that there was no bia between them, and then the second husband cannot make a claim in Beis Din that there's no basulim, she gets a ksubas moneh. I don't understand. Maybe she did znus after the kiddushin to the second husband, and then it's very serious. It's a znus. Maybe the reason she's a be'ula is not because obviously she did have relations with her first husband. No, maybe she did znus after she was a kiddushin with the second husband. Omer of Shra. So then why do you say ein lo tainis basulim? Don't bother coming to Beis Din with your claim, because it's true that as far as the ksuba is concerned, that maybe she had relations with the first husband, etc. But maybe not. Maybe she had relations with somebody after she was married to the second husband and is nus. Omer of Shravya kegoin shekidesh uboal alto. We're talking about that the second husband knew without any shadow of a doubt that after the kiddushin there was definitely no znus, because as soon as he did the kiddushin, he had relations with her, and straight away he's got a question. There was no basulim here, so there was certainly no znus after the kiddushin. The question was, but I got married to you assuming that you were a basula. The edim said that with the first husband you didn't have a time to do any bia and to have any physical relations with him. So for that we say that in this particular case, or Rav says, Ravashi says in this particular case, as soon as there's a chuppah with the first husband, we assume, or we have to allow for the fact that she could have been a be'ula. This whole dialogue we had from this brisa, and then we had Rava and Ravashi, and etc. The same dialogue was not on this brisa, but on the Mishnah on Daf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. We saw in the Mishnah that Basula almono grusha chalutzo min nisuin. We saw there what happens if there's a nisuin, there's a chuppah, and she's still a basula, even though she's an almono grusha v'chalutza, she's a widow, divorced, or in the case of yibum, or in the absence of yibum, chalitza. Then we say that, and we know that she's still a basula. Then we say that ksubas on moneh, that the ksuba is only one moneh, is 100 zuz, like an almona, as like a be'ula, ve'in la tainis basulim. And there's no tainis basulim. That's what we saw in our Mishnah. Because after chuppah, there's no tainis basulim. Similar to what we saw in the Brisa at the end of Yud Aleph Amud Beis, we saw in the Mishnah on Daf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. So asks the Gemara, basula min anisuin heicha mishkachas la. How could it be that she's had nisuin? There's been a chuppah, and do we not assume that the night after the chuppah, there's relations? How can she be a basula if she's already had nisuin? Says the Gemara, is if she had the chuppah, and for whatever reason, good or other, they didn't have any beer together, and therefore she's still a basula. So Omar Rava. So in the same as Rava in the first version deduced this from the Brisa, Rava is deducing it from the Mishnah. Zoisemeres. That means we assume that it was nichnas al chuppah v'loy nivalo. That means even though she was married first, she's not a be'ula. And now the second husband, who assumes she's a basula, konsa b'cheskas basula v'nimtzes be'ula, the Mishnah says ksuvas amona, that the ksuba is a mona, because even though he assumed that she wasn't nivalo, so why shouldn't she get? So why can't he say that it's a mekach tol, she should get nothing? Says Rava, no. Konsa b'cheskas basula v'nimtzes be'ula ksubas amona. Ravashi again says no. Ravashi Omar la'olam, normally konsa b'cheskas basula v'nimtzes be'ula eimelacha ba'al melesla klal. Of course there's mekach tols, like we saw from Rava on Daf Yud Aleph Amud Beis. Of course there's mekach tos. Over here in the Mishnah, over here we're not talking about a regular girl that you had every reason to believe she's a basula. You're talking about a girl who's actually been in the chuppah. A girl who's been under the chuppah is not to be assumed to be a basula. Why do you say in the Mishnah that she gets a ksuba of a mona, and there's no tainis basulim, which means if you didn't find basulim, even though you assumed that there should be basulim, you don't come to Beis Din. Why are you not afraid? Maybe she did znus after the kiddushin, and if it's znus, it's a big issue. And the same answer as before. Amar of Shrav Yoka going to Kiddush or Baal Alta. He knows that definitely after the Kiddushin of the second husband there was no znus, because he did the beer with her immediately afterwards. Nobody got their hands on her before then. The whole question is, I thought you were a basula, and there's no basulim, mekach tos. So that we say that in this case, since it was kvar nichnas al chuppah, there's no such claim. Says the Gemara, Man de masni lo abraisa kol shkena masnisin. For that version, the first version we saw here, that Rabbi said what he said, and Rav Ashi responded what he said. That Rabbi said from the Brisa that says that if there's Eidim that say that the first couple, with the first marriage, didn't have any relations, and then the second husband claims there's no basulim, we don't give him that claim, and she gets her ksuba. So Rabbi said from here you see that every konsa b'cheskas b'sula of an imtes b'ula has a ksuba. And Rav Ashi says no, it could be a regular konsa b'cheskas b'sula, would be a mekach tos, and here it's different because at the end of the day they had a chuppah. So that version, kol shkena masnisin. Then on the Mishnah, where in the Mishnah you don't have a guarantee from Eidim that there was no bia in the first husband. It was just assumed that they didn't have time or they didn't do the bia. In that case, it definitely, if Rabbi were to say that you have proof from there that konsa b'cheskas b'sula v'nimtes b'ula, that you have a ksuba, that Rav Ashi would say no, there's no proof. A regular konsa b'cheskas b'sula, it would be a mekach tos, and over there it's different, because over there you don't even have Eidim that they didn't have a bia. Then that would make sense that Rav Ashi would respond that way to Rabbi. So man demasni lo abraisa kol shkena masnisin. However, man demasni lo masnisin, the opinion that learns this whole dialogue on the Mishnah, which is talking about where there's no Eidim, aval abraisa loy. In the case of the Brisa, they wouldn't have had this dialogue. Rav Ashi wouldn't have said what he said. Rav Ashi wouldn't have said that normally Rabbi's right, that saying had Rabbi said what he said from, in the case of the Brisa, that you've got Eidim here, and who say that they didn't have a bia, and nonetheless they don't have a claim. So Rabbi says from here you see konsa b'cheskas b'sula v'nimtzes b'ula, it's never a claim. Over here, Rav Ashi may well not have answered back that normally there is a claim, and just here is different, because here it's not different to everywhere else, because here you've got Eidim. If Eidim say they didn't have a bia, that is a very proper konsa b'cheskas b'sula. He had no reason to suspect that maybe there was a bia. So in the version that Rabbi said what he said on the Brisa, okay, Rav Ashi responded that even though there's Eidim, since she had a chuppah with the first husband, you cannot assume necessarily that it's a basula. But if this dialogue happened on the Mishnah, in the Mishnah there were no Eidim, then in that case Rav Ashi would not have said on the Brisa is different to everywhere else. No, if the Brisa says there's Eidim that she didn't have, that they didn't have bia, then it's exactly the case of a regular konsa b'cheskas basula. Here the husband can say, no, I relied on these Eidim, and since the Eidim said there was no bia, I had every right to assume that you were a basula. And konsa b'cheskas basula v'nimtzeis b'ula, were Rabbi to say it from this Brisa, Rav Ashi may well have agreed with him that we have proof from here that in every konsa b'cheskas basula v'nimtzeis b'ula, that there is a ksuba of mona. But according to this version, the whole dialogue of Rabbi and Rav Ashi was not on the Brisa, it was on the Mishnah. And in Yitzchok in the next shiur, we're going to continue from here.